Angkor Wat is a temple complex in Cambodia. It's located on a site that measures 162.6 hectares. That's 1,626,000 square meter of area. It is the largest religious structure in the world. Based on our excavations, it seems that the occupation mounds were abandoned or their use was transformed during this period. However, the temple of Angkor Wat itself was never abandoned. The landscape surrounding the temple appears to be reoccupied by the late 14th or early 15th centuries. During the period, Angkor was supposedly sacked and abandoned by Ayutthaya and used until the 17th or 18th century. One of the most fascinating questions that everybody has is how big were cities that you have just seen on a map or have just heard about. For example, the world's first city of Uruk. How many people did it have? Historians and archaeologists argue about it all the time, but there is a consensus that it had about 40,000 people 5,000 years ago. London, a teeming metropolitan that we all know about today, had around 250,000 people living in it during its medieval times, which increased to 600,000 by the early 17th century. But what about large cities in Asia? Of course, we have some cities that we know about, for example, Mohenjo-daro. We also know about civilizational cities and ethos that came up around Patliputra, or what is today known as Patna. However, one of the largest ancient cities in the world was in Southeast Asia. It was part of what is referred to as the Greater Angkor region, located in what is today known as Cambodia. Angkor Wat was built by Suryavarman II in the early 12th century. It was to be based in his capital, Yashodharapura, the capital of the Khmer Empire. Angkor Wat was to be the state temple and his eventual mausoleum. The Angkor Wat is one of the most famous icons of the Angkorian civilization. It is so strongly associated with the Cambodian identity that even today it appears on the nation's flag. It has been one of the most recognized and celebrated icons of Southeast Asia. The temple was part of the Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire was part of the Angkor civilization. And this has always baffled historians. What happened to the Angkor civilization? The Angkor civilization is believed to have started in AD 802. The heartland in the capital city was on the bank of the Tony Sap Lake in northwest Cambodia. The Angkorian state was founded and grew during a period of favorable climate with abundant rainfall. The Angkorian rulers controlled a large portion of what was then known as the mainland Southeast Asia. The Angkor civilization was booming in the early 1100s, and that's when the Angkor Wat temple construction started. It was supposed to be a recreation of the Hindu universe. It has multiple features that mark it out, but one of the most important things is the temple mound, which is supposed to be representing the Mount Meru, the center of the universe. The temple is surrounded by a large moat, symbolizing the sea of milk, from which Amrit, or an elixir of immortality, was supposed to have been created. It took 2 centuries for the temple to be completed, and the last major stone temple at Angkor was fully constructed in 1295. The latest Sanskrit inscription dates to that same year, or so the scholars believe. The last inscription in Khmer, the language of Cambodia, appears a few decades later in 1327. One of the most fascinating features of the Angkor Wat architecture has been the shift that has happened in the temple architecture while it was under construction. The temple started construction as a Hindu temple. Sometime towards the end, and when the entire construction process was over, it had transformed into a Buddhist temple. This religious shift disrupted the pre-existing Hindu-based power structures. The emphasis moved from state-sponsored stone temples and royal bureaucracy to community-based Buddhist pagodas built from wood. This was also the time when the Khmer Empire was increasing its maritime trade with China. This was also the time that the capital was relocated further south, near the modern capital of Phnom Penh. It allowed rulers to take advantage of the multiple economic opportunities that were available to them. So, what happened to the Angkor Wat? What clues can the temple itself yield about its civilizational decline? Alison Kyra Carter and the team that she has been part of has been excavating in the Angkor Wat temple enclosure. They do so with the Apsara Authority, that is the government body that oversees Angkor's archaeological park, and they've been working in this area since 2010. The archaeologists and the team that they are part of, they just don't focus on the temple, they focus around the temple. During different field seasons, they're able to excavate mounds, they're able to uncover remains of dump ceramics, they are able to look at hearth and the burnt food remains, and all of this is supposed to yield to them a picture of what was happening in Angkor Wat. Using all of these tools and the collected burnt organic remains, primarily piece of wood charcoal that is associated with features like hearths, they used radiocarbon dating to date the different pieces that they recovered. All of this was done to build a timeline of when people were using the temple space so that there is a much more nuanced idea of who was occupying the Angkor Wat and what timeline was the Angkor Wat operational in. The research and the radiocarbon dating tells a different story. In a piece written for The Conversation, Alison Kyra Carter has this to say about radiocarbon dates telling a different story. Our dates show that the landscape around Angkor Wat might have initially been inhabited in the 11th century, prior to the temple's construction in the early 12th century. Then, the Angkor Wat temple enclosure's landscape, including the mound pond grid system, was laid out. People subsequently inhabited the mounds. Then, we have a gap or a break in our radiocarbon dates. It's difficult to line it up with calendar years, but we think it likely ranges from the late 12th or early 13th century to the late 14th or early 15th century. This gap coincides with many of the changes taking place across Angkor. Based on our excavations, it seems that the occupation mounds were abandoned or their use was transformed during this period. However, the temple of Angkor Wat itself was never abandoned. The landscape surrounding the temple appears to be reoccupied by the late 14th or early 15th centuries. During the period, Angkor was supposedly sacked and abandoned by Ayutthaya and used until the 17th or 18th century. The changing shape of the city, seen from the civic center to what can be called as the Angkor metropolitan area, exploded. And just after its explode, the Angkor civilization or the Angkor city came to be abandoned. Then some people moved back in and continued living and using that space for a period of another 50 or 100 years. But then they moved out again. These are questions that have defined the nature and characteristic of this particular place and also continue to haunt the political establishment of Cambodia till today. It was not long ago that Khmer Rouge terrorized the people of Cambodia, and one of the iconic things that they used as a leitmotif was the Angkor Wat.